The Truro murders were a series of killings committed between December 1976 and February 1977 in Adelaide, South Australia. They derived the name Truro from the small town north of Adelaide, where the majority of the victims were later dumped. The Truro murders were committed by two men. Christopher Worrell, who was the principal offender in this case. Worrell was born on January the 17th, 1954, and he actually served in the Royal Australian Air Force. The second man was James Miller, who was born on February the 2nd, 1940. Now, Miller was a lifelong petty criminal. He'd first been in the McGill's boy home at the age of 11, and he was first inside an adult prison when he was 15. And eventually, Worrell and Miller were bound to meet up in prison. To explain how Worrell and Miller met in prison, we have to first understand how Worrell ended up in prison. Now, the first story begins on Wednesday, January the 9th, 1974, in a most curious incident. This is a map of Adelaide. This is the western suburbs of Adelaide. Along here is Anzac Highway. Now, Worrell, along with an unidentified woman, kidnapped at knife point another woman here on Anzac Highway in the Keswick region, so around here somewhere. Now, they then drove this woman at knife point to West Beach Road, which is right here. So this is West Beach Road, and exactly where Worrell stopped, I don't know. But anyway, so they took this woman, kidnapped her, parked around here somewhere on West Beach Road. Now, they robbed the woman of a $30 watch and $1.50 in cash. While they were there, however, a police patrol car just happened to come along and saw what was happening and came over. Now, Worrell, obviously the police officer wanted to know what the hell they were doing there. One can only assume this was at night. And Worrell threatened, before the policeman arrived, or police officer, Worrell threatened the woman and said he would kill her if she, so keep her mouth shut. So I guess the police officer came over, asked what was happening. Worrell managed to talk his way out of it. The police left. Luckily, the woman that Worrell and this other woman had kidnapped was released. But fat lot of good of that did, because she obviously went to the police. Worrell was later arrested, but despite kidnapping a woman at knife point and robbing her, Worrell was only given a 2-year suspended sentence and fined $320. That was his only punishment for that particular crime. On Monday, April the 15th, 1974, Christopher Worrell struck again. This time he picked up a 20-year-old woman and offered her a lift. Now, where he picked her up from, I'm not exactly sure, but most likely the city. She said she was heading to her sister's place in Edwardstown. Edwardstown, which we're looking at right now, is a suburb of Adelaide, probably the southwestern suburbs of Adelaide. Not that far from the city, maybe 6 or so kilometres from the city of Adelaide. So the woman got into Worrell's car, and Worrell began driving toward Edwardstown. However, on approaching the destination here in Edwardstown, Worrell produces a knife. He then drives her at knife point to the Glandor Oval in Edwardstown. That's this oval right here. So Worrell parks in this area. He ties the woman's hands behind her back and gags her. Worrell's intention, I assume, was to rape her, but apparently he was unable to rape her. Exactly why that is, I'm not sure. Perhaps he became impotent, or whatever the circumstance. Apparently he didn't rape her. He became enraged, and then he started crying. So, you know, maybe he was wrestling with his inner demons or whatever, but he agreed to let her go if she didn't go to the police. Well, he did let her go, fortunately, and the woman obviously did go to the police, again fortunately, and Worrell was arrested and charged with rape. This is the old Adelaide Gaol, or the Adelaide Jail, very old prison here in Adelaide. It was first opened in 1841, soon after the establishment of the colony of Adelaide, and it remained open until 1998. And just show you where it is in relation to the rest of the city. It's just on the outskirts of the central business district. So yeah, that's the centre of Adelaide, and the old Adelaide Jail just over here next to the train tracks and the River Torrens. So in April 1974, this is where Christopher Worrell and James Miller meet. They meet in the number 6 remand yard. So one of these areas in here, one of these yards here, number 6, sure which one it is, but that's where Miller and Worrell first meet. At the time, Worrell is only 20 years old, Miller is 34 years old. Worrell is on remand for rape from the Edwardstown incident, and Miller's in there for one of his many petty crimes. While in prison, the two share a cell. Now, just a word about the unique relationship between Worrell and Miller and their individual sexuality. Miller was certainly a homosexual, and there was no doubt that he was, well, I think in love with Worrell. I think he was besotted with Worrell. Miller was a weak, low dominant individual, whereas Worrell was much more dominant. As for Christopher Worrell's sexuality, I would say most likely he was predominantly heterosexual, though I think with bisexual tendencies. It's interesting that all the girls, well, the victims he later murdered were girls, were women. Worrell, by all accounts, was quite a strikingly handsome young man, and I think he used that to his advantage, both in prison and outside on the streets when he would begin murdering young women. And I think he certainly used it to his advantage against James Miller. And as I said, Miller was absolutely besotted with him, and Worrell knew that he could get Miller to do just about anything. So the two are here in the Adelaide jail, sharing a cell. While they're in their cell, they bond and become, according to Miller, at least best mates. At one point, Worrell actually confesses to Miller that he, Worrell, is responsible for the murder of 2 women hitchhikers back when Worrell was in the Air Force and he was driving the long, desolate distance between Perth and Adelaide. Now, if that's true or not, we don't know. No unknown bodies have ever been connected with Worrell. I think Worrell claimed that he buried them out there in that vast distance between Adelaide and Perth, so who knows if Worrell was telling the truth. He may have just been boasting, maybe trying to put a bit of a scare in Miller, or just as likely he was telling the truth. Nonetheless, in June 1974, Worrell is convicted of rape and given a 6-year sentence, and he's transferred to the Yatala Labour Prison. We'll just cruise over to Yatala. Now, Yatala is further north. I guess at the time in 1974, the Adelaide prison was being used perhaps as the remand centre. There was no actual remand centre in Adelaide, I believe, until about circa 1984, certainly the mid-80s. So I think Adelaide Gaol was being used for that purpose. So yeah, Worrell is transferred here to Yatala prison. James Miller is also convicted of larceny, and he's given a 3-month sentence and also sent here to Yatala. where he reunites with Worrell, though I believe they weren't in the same cells at this point. Now, James Miller is released, but in January 1975, Miller is once again arrested for yet another of his petty crimes. This time, he's arrested for stealing 4,000 sunglasses, which I can only assume he was in possession of to sell. And Miller is given an 18-month sentence here in Yatala prison, where of course Worrell is still incarcerated. On February the 11th, 1976, James Miller is released, and on October the 5th, 1976, Christopher Worrell is released. So Worrell served a little over 2 years of his 6-year sentence for the rape. So in October 1976, Christopher Worrell and James Miller are on the streets. They reunite, and it's just 2 months, 2.5 months after Worrell is released, that the Truro murders begin. Thursday night, December 23rd, 1976. Worrell and Miller park their cars here in Grenfell Street in the car park and head into the city around the Rundle Mall area. The shops are open late night for Christmas. After walking around and buying nothing, Miller and Worrell, or in fact Miller, returns to the car here and drives off in a westerly direction. And Worrell tells Miller that he'll meet him outside the Majestic Hotel nearby on King William Street. I'm outside 100 King William Street, which in December 1976 was the Majestic Hotel. Now, James Miller drove here from Grenfell Street. He was told to he was on the lookout for Christopher Worrell. When Miller didn't see Worrell, he drove around the block a few times. Eventually, on one of his go-arounds, Miller spotted Worrell standing outside the Majestic Hotel, but this time he was with a young girl, 18-year-old Veronica Knight. Now, Veronica had been in the city with a friend to buy a new dress for a coming trip to Melbourne. Veronica and her friend had actually boarded a bus to go home. Veronica lived nearby in Carrington Street. But when she got on the bus, Veronica realised she had left the dress back in Rundle Mall. So Veronica got off the bus by herself and went back to Rundle Mall to look for it on that Thursday night, December 23rd, 1976. And that's obviously where she met Worrell. Worrell must have offered her a lift home to nearby Carrington Street. And she drove. Worrell and Veronica walked out here in front of the old Majestic Hotel, waited for Miller. Miller spotted them. So then Worrell and Veronica Knight got into the car with Miller. So Veronica Knight was picked up and got into the car with Worrell and Miller at 100 King William Street, which is right in here in the city of Adelaide. Now, the time Veronica was staying at a boarding house in Carrington Street, and Carrington Street is just a few blocks away, slightly south of the city, of the main heart of the city. So this is Carrington Street here. Now, I don't know the exact address Veronica was staying at, so if she wanted to ride back, it's a very short distance from, show you that. So that's where Veronica was picked up, and Carrington Street down here. Now, in 1984, James Miller released a book called Don't Call Me Killer, which was his recounting of his life, and obviously the crimes of Christopher Worrell. Now, in that book, he gave descriptions about what happened when he picked up the girls, when Worrell picked up the girls and Miller drove them to various locations. So I'm going to give you Miller's version of events, but with a disclaimer that whether that's completely the truth or not is, well, open up to interpretation. I think with a lot of Miller, there's truth there, there's some, but also some self-serving alterations. I definitely think Christopher Worrell was the serial killer. It was his initiative that wanted to murder girls. What Miller's part exactly in that is not 100% sure. Miller was a weak-willed, cowardly individual who could have easily prevented these murders. But anyway, so yeah, I just wanted to point that out. So I will give you the version of Miller's story in the abduction of the girls. Now, according to James Miller, Veronica told Worrell that she needed to be in by 11:30 p.m. at a boarding house, and Worrell ensured her that she would. So they decided to go for a drive. Miller claims they drove into the Adelaide Hills. And the Adelaide Hills were east of the city. So yeah, and this over here somewhere, if Miller was telling the truth. So that was Miller's original interpretation of events, but he also did contradict himself, as he often would, that they in fact drove all the way to Truro. And it's a distinct possibility that the girls were picked up and then tied up and driven perhaps all the way to the locations where they were found, and perhaps were murdered there before anywhere else. But anyway, so whatever happened, Miller said that when they were in the Adelaide Hills, he went for a walk from the car, which would become a modus operandi, to give what he claims Worrell and the girl alone time. When he got back to the car, the girl was dead, and Veronica on this occasion was dead, murdered by Christopher Worrell. Miller says he was furious at Worrell, but that Worrell threatened him. Despite all of this, Miller helped cover up the crime and dispose of the body. So they drove all the way to Truro, which is about 80 kilometres from Adelaide, and down a road called Swamp Road off the Sturt Highway up here. This is Swamp Road here, and Veronica's body was dumped in this general location. Sunday morning, January 2nd, 1977, here on King William Street, Adelaide. At about 9 a.m. that Sunday morning, Worrell and Miller drove into the city, and Miller dropped Worrell off here at the western entry of Rundle Mall, and he told Miller to meet him at the eastern end at Pulteney Street. And so Worrell exited the car and began walking into Rundle Mall, where he would walk the length of. So Christopher Worrell walked the length of Rundle Mall until he emerged here at the eastern end with Pulteney Street, where James Miller was waiting for him. But this time Worrell was not alone. He was now with 15-year-old Tanya Kenny. Now Tanya had spent New Year's Eve down near Victor Harbour, south of the city, then had spent a night at a friend's place at Moana before catching a bus and making her way into the city, where she obviously met Worrell here in Rundle Mall. And here she and Worrell got into the car with James Miller, with Tanya sitting in between them both before they drove away. So when Tanya Kenny got into the car with Worrell and Miller on Pulteney Street in the centre of Adelaide, Worrell said they would drive her home if she didn't mind first stopping at the sister of James Miller's house in Albert Park, where Miller was supposed to pick up some clothes. At that point, Miller's sister's house was empty, as the family had just moved out. Tanya must have agreed to that, or they forced her. Again, we're only going by what James Miller said. So they drove to the suburb of Albert Park in Adelaide. Albert Park is in the western suburbs of Adelaide. It's in this area here. It's near places like Alberton and Woodville. I don't know the exact address where Miller's sister had lived. All I know it happened it was a house in Albert Park. So according to Miller, Worrell and Tanya went into the house while Miller waited in the car. At some point, Worrell came out of the house without Tanya. Miller realized that something bad had happened again, and he ran into the house and he found Tanya dead on the floor with her hands and feet tied and her mouth taped. Again, Miller claimed he screamed at Worrell, and Worrell threatened him. But nonetheless, despite all these protestations from James Miller, he helped Worrell cover up the crime. They put Tanya into a cupboard where she wouldn't be disturbed. And at that point, Miller and Worrell then drove to Wingfield. We'll go there now. Wingfield is further north of Albert Park. It's in the northern suburbs. And they took Tanya... they scouted this area for a burial place and dug a hole. At the time, it was known as the Dean Rifle Range, this area around here. Now in January 1977, this area it's still somewhat rural, but it's much more built up these days. And again, I don't know exactly where Tanya's body was buried. But after they dug a hole, Worrell and Miller returned to the house in Albert Park. So we'll go back there again. They drove back to Albert Park in the western suburbs. They retrieved Tanya's body from the cupboard, put her into the boot of the car, and then at night they drove back north to Wingfield, where Tanya was buried in an unknown location in this general vicinity. Friday night, January 21st, 1977. Christopher Worrell and James Miller were driving along King William Street, where I am right now. In fact, I'm standing in front of 107 King William Street in the centre of Adelaide. On that Friday night, Worrell saw sitting on a step right here near the old Ambassador's Hotel, which was in this building right here. They saw 16-year-old Julie Makita. Now Julie had spent the day selling jewellery on King William Street at the Southern Cross Arcade with a friend. She had finished work at around 5 p.m. She had spent the evening at the Majestic Hotel, leaving circa 10 p.m. Now if you remember the Veronica Knight story, the old Majestic Hotel was just over the road at 100 King William Street. So Worrell saw Julie Makita sitting on a step here in front of the old Ambassador's Hotel. Worrell got out of the car and approached Julie, obviously offering her a lift, and Julie got into the car. So Julie Makita was abducted and picked up by Worrell and Miller here at 107 King William Street. Now after Julie got into the car, what happened next? Again, we only have James Miller's account of what happened. According to Miller, he drove north and he said that Julie told them that she was heading home, but was relaxed with Worrell. So Worrell told Miller to drive to a quiet place. Well, this seems a bit odd. If Julie was heading home, why she would voluntarily accompany Worrell and Miller to a quiet place, but that's what Miller claims anyway. So driving north from the centre of the city, we'll head out to Heaslip Road, which is way down north. Apparently Worrell and Miller drove via Port Wakefield Road, and they drove into this general area here in Heaslip Road, north of Adelaide. Miller said they drove to a quiet place and to a deserted road at night. Worrell and, again, only going by what Miller said, he said Worrell and Julie got into the back seat, and Worrell began tying Julie up, whose attitude he said was playful. Miller had seen this stuff before, so he got out of the car and walked away. As he walked into the night, he says he heard Julie cry out in pain, and Miller went back to the car. At that point he said he saw Worrell and Julie outside the car, that Worrell's on top of Julie strangling her. Miller claimed he yelled, "What are you doing?" and grabbed Worrell. Worrell pushed him away, saying, "Get away or I'll kill you." And Miller walked away. And at some point Julie was dead. But Miller also contradicted himself by saying that Julie was murdered at the paddock where her body was later found. So there's a strong possibility that Worrell and Miller forced Julie all the way out to near Truro. But what we do know next is that for sure that Miller and Worrell drove a considerable distance out to Adelaide, which is just outside the Truro district, and that's where Julie Makita's body would be found. Sunday afternoon, February 6, 1977. Miller and Worrell drive here to the Adelaide railway station on North Terrace. So between 3 and 4 p.m. that Sunday afternoon, Miller and Worrell drove off North Terrace into what used to be called Station Road. Now these days the roads are blocked off and it's all different, but back in 1977 it was an access road. So after parking in here, Worrell left Miller in the car and he walked into Adelaide railway station, which is just down here, while Miller waited for him back on Station Road. So after only 15 minutes, Worrell returned back up the Station Road here at the train station, and with him was 16-year-old Sylvia Pittman. Now Sylvia had come in from Truro, which is in the northwestern suburbs, about 18 kilometres out of Adelaide, and she was about to catch a train back to Truro when Worrell approached her. Worrell offered her a lift, and so Sylvia accepted, and they came back out here, and Sylvia got back in the car with Worrell and Miller. Monday night, February 7th, 1977. Worrell drops Miller off here at Victoria Square, Adelaide. Just do a quick 360 to show you where I am here at Victoria Square. That is Flinders Street running to the right of screen, Franklin Street to the left. Now after dropping Miller off here, Worrell said he was going to go look and pick up a girl. So Miller bought a bottle of Coke from a nearby shop, I assume, and he came over here to Victoria Square, where he sat for the next 40 minutes patiently waiting for Worrell. When Worrell returned in his car, he was now with 26-year-old Vicky Howell. Vicky had left her home in Corolta Park in suburban Adelaide earlier that evening after she'd got into an argument with her partner. And she was last seen at a bus stop to catch a bus here into the city. So obviously at some point she encountered Christopher Worrell. She went with Worrell and they picked Miller up. Miller took over driving. Worrell sat in the front passenger seat and Vicky in the back. And the car drove off. Now, Vicky Howell was picked up by Worrell and then James Miller somewhere around in the city of Adelaide, and Worrell with Vicky in the car of course met up with Miller here on Victoria Square, which is this area here in the heart of the city. Now when they got in the car, this again according to James Miller's account, Miller took over the driving, Worrell was in the front passenger seat and Vicky Howell was in the back. Miller says he drove southeast as Worrell and Vicky kissed in the back seat. That's Miller's account, remember? So he said southeast, which would be somewhere in this vicinity. Miller said on Worrell's instructions, Miller drove to the Adelaide Hills. Again, so this would be this area in here, southeast of the city. According to Miller, he parked in a side track near a quarry. Now I have no idea where this was or if this was even factual or not. Again, this is just Miller's account, so but if that was correct, it'd be somewhere in this area here in the Adelaide Hills. Miller went for his usual walk. When he returned, Vicky was dead, and Miller says they then drove to Truro, which we will go to now, which is a good 80 or so kilometres from the city of Adelaide. And yeah, so this is Swamp Road, just on the outskirts of Truro, and that's where Vicky was found. Wednesday night, February the 9th, 1977. James Miller and Christopher Worrell were driving their car south along King William Street, so heading in that direction. They didn't get far though, because in front of number 52 King William Street, which is whereabouts you're looking now, the police pulled them over circa 8 p.m. out front of what was then the Ern Smith's electrical store. Miller and Worrell were driving an old bomb. The police inspected the car and defected it, ruling it unroadworthy. Police placed a defect sticker on the car for having bold tyres. The police ordered that the car be driven home and have the tyres replaced. Now, while all this was happening, right across the road, right over here, in front of the Edmund Wright House here on King William Street, was a 15-year-old girl named Connie Ordonides. Now, I apologise if I'm mispronouncing the surname there. Connie was also known by the surname Jordan. Now, she was waiting for a bus. Connie had left her home in Brooklyn Park at about 7:30 p.m. that evening, and she told her sister she was going to a friend's house and they were going to a drive-in. So she was at this location at about 8 p.m. Now, she watched as the police pulled over Worrell and Miller, and she was giggling and laughing at their expense, probably good-naturedly. But it would be a fatal move, because Worrell noticed Connie across the road here. So I'm in the approximate location Connie would have been standing when she observed Worrell and Miller being pulled over by the police. Now, on observing Worrell after the police let them go, Worrell told Miller to do a U-turn Now, I'm not sure exactly where he would have done that, somewhere along here on King William Street. And Miller and Worrell drove up on their car right here on the western side of King William Street. Worrell called Connie over to the car. They had a chat, a conversation. Worrell asked her if Connie wanted a ride, and Connie said she was heading to Enfield. Worrell said they would drive her there. Connie got into the car and they would have driven in a northerly direction down that way. Connie was picked up here in King William Street in the heart of Adelaide and got into the car with Worrell and Miller. Again, we go by James Miller's account. He claims that Connie said she was heading to Enfield, which is north of the city in that direction. Worrell said they would drive her there. So according to Miller, he then drove north and got his way onto Churchill Road in the Prospect region, sort of the inner north of Adelaide. So this is the start of Prospect Road here, Churchill Road, sorry. So Miller claims they drove down here. Miller says Worrell got into the back seat with Connie. At some point, Miller stopped the car and removed the defect sticker that the police had put on them back in King William Street. Driving this way, Miller then claims they drove onto Days Road, which is in the Regency Park area of Adelaide. So we'll just have a bit of a pan back here and show you where. So I guess you'd call that more the northwest of Adelaide. So according to Miller, the usual thing happened. Miller left Worrell and Connie in the car. Miller went for his walk. He came back. Apparently he came back a bit too early, and Worrell and Connie were still in the back seat. Everything was fine. So Miller walks off again. This time when Miller returns the second time, he claims that Connie is now dead. So after that, they then drove Connie's body to... Oops, hang on, I'm going back the wrong way here. Bear with me. Going back to King William Street. So after Days Road, they drove Connie all the way to Truro, where her body was placed by the side of Swamp Road. So that's James Miller's account. There's a strong possibility that perhaps they just drove straight to Truro, where Connie was murdered. But yeah, so Swamp Road in Truro is where Connie's remains were left. Saturday night, February 12th, 1977. Christopher Worrell and James Miller were driving around Adelaide when they came down Hindley Street, which is where I'm walking at the moment, heading in an easterly direction. Some point along here, Worrell and Miller spotted 20-year-old Deborah Lamb. Now, Deborah, at 6 p.m. that evening, had left her Windsor Gardens caravan park and travelled here into the city. She met a partner whom she'd had a child with, and eventually they went to the Gino's Fun Parlour, which was somewhere down here on Hindley Street. Now, I don't know the exact location where Gino's Fun Parlour used to be, but it was somewhere along here on Hindley Street as I walk in the easterly direction. Worrell spotted her. Miller did a U-turn in the car. Worrell got out and approached Debbie. He obviously offered her a lift. Debbie accepted. Worrell got in the back seat, Deborah in the front with Miller driving, and the two of them set off. The three of them, I should say, set off. So somewhere along here on Hindley Street, in the heart of Adelaide is where Worrell and Miller picked up Debbie Lamb. So Deborah Lamb was picked up by Worrell and Miller along Hindley Street here in Adelaide. That's Morford Street there. That's Hindley Street. So somewhere in that general vicinity was Deborah picked up. Now, of course, Debbie got into the car with Worrell and Miller. According to James Miller's account, Worrell asked her if she wanted to go for a drive. Again, this was around midnight or so. Worrell instructed Miller to drive to Port Gawler Beach, which is where we'll go to next. Some considerable distance from the city. That's further north of Adelaide. So this is the Port Gawler area, Port Gawler Beach area. When they drove there, Miller claims he walked off for about half an hour, which would have been quite dark and desolate out there at that time. He returns to the car when he sees Worrell pushing something into a hole, and it was Debbie. Worrell was burying Debbie in the sand area. Worrell asked Miller for help in burying her. Miller claims that he screamed at him as usual, but again, as usual, assisted Worrell, and Debbie was buried. There is some speculation that after Worrell murdered Deborah Lamb, that she was actually buried alive somewhere in the Port Gawler Beach area. On February the 12th, 1977, Christopher Worrell had murdered Deborah Lamb. Deborah would be mercifully Worrell's final victim, but only because of a twist of fate. And on Friday, February the 18th, 1977, Christopher Worrell, James Miller, and a female friend of theirs, 21-year-old Debbie Scoos, decided to take a quick trip down to Mount Gambier for the weekend. Now, Debbie was a friend of Miller and Worrell's. She was the wife of ex-wife of a friend of Worrell and Miller's. And they just became good friends. So they decided on a bit of a spur of the moment to take a trip down to Mount Gambier. So let's cruise down to Mount Gambier. Mount Gambier is way down in the southeast corner of South Australia. So Miller and Worrell and Debbie drove all the way down to Mount Gambier. They booked into a travel lodge. Exact location, I'm not sure. They arrived in Mount Gambier in the early morning of Sunday, February the 19th, 1977. On that Saturday, after booking into the travel lodge, Debbie went shopping by herself. Worrell and Miller bought a shotgun at a store. Miller claims they were intending to shoot rabbits on the way home. They reunited with Debbie. The trio then visited the Blue Lake, which is down here. Blue Lake, of course, is a famous tourist attraction in Mount Gambier. Quite an impressive spectacle indeed. After visiting the Blue Lake, they then went to the old Mount Gambier jail. Now, let's just find this. Not far from the old Blue Lake, So, this is the old Mount Gambier goal. This is the old jail. There's a new jail there now, which was first built in 1995, but obviously this being 1977 would have been the old prison. Worrell and Miller wanted to visit an old friend there, but when they arrived there, the friend of theirs in prison had already been released, so that was that. Their next port of call was the Mount Gambier Airport. So that's, I assume, the same as it was in 1977. This is the Mount Gambier Airport. There was an historic aircraft display being held at the airport that Saturday. Miller thought Worrell would be interested. Of course, Worrell had served in the Australian Air Force. But it was here Miller noted that Worrell's mood began to abruptly change, and one of Worrell's dark moods descended on him. So they went back to the motel where they were staying, and as Worrell was in one of his moods, Miller decided to call the trip over early, and they decided to drive back to the city, back to Adelaide. So on leaving Mount Gambier, they stopped and bought petrol and beer, and most interestingly, they picked up a girl hitchhiking. Of course, Debbie was in the car. The girl was dropped off. There was nothing happened with the girl, which is interesting. But obviously, with Debbie in the car, I guess Worrell wouldn't have felt compelled to do anything. They next stopped briefly at a place called Mount Burr. So this is on the way back to Adelaide. So Mount Burr, just heading north of Mount Gambier. Yes, so they had a brief stop at Mount Burr. Then they drove, their next port of call was Millicent, which is not that far from Mount Burr. So this is Millicent in here. Here they stopped. Miller had been driving. Miller had driven the car all the way from Mount Gambier, but Miller was feeling hot and tired, and he let Worrell take over the driving, as according to Miller, Worrell's mood appeared to be better. So they then began driving to Kingston. So they began continuing north until they were approaching Kingston. And it was by now circa 5:30 p.m. on this Saturday afternoon. Worrell was drinking and driving, and Miller noted that his mood once again began getting darker, and he began driving fast. Debbie herself complained about Worrell's driving, and she became upset. They did stop the car briefly so Worrell could urinate, and the radiator apparently was boiling. They got back in the car, and Worrell continued driving like a lunatic. Now, they were about 11 kilometres outside of Kingston. So this is Kingston in here. They were about 11 kilometres outside the city, outside the town, and there's two ways to come in from their direction. The Prince's Highway along here, they could have been, or this main road here. I'm not exactly sure which roads they took, but on one of these, as they were driving, Worrell was apparently doing 130 kilometres an hour. And remember, they were driving an absolute old bomb of a car that was barely hanging together. And as they sped toward Kingston, Worrell apparently yelled, "We've got a blowout." I guess one of the tyres exploded, and the Valiant, the car they were driving, flipped and rolled after Worrell lost control. The car remained upright, and Miller remained inside the car. However, Christopher Worrell and Debbie Scoos had been thrown clear from the car. Miller got out, and on the road he found Christopher Worrell and Debbie Scoos dead. So while it was a tragic end for poor Debbie, who just was a victim of circumstance, this crash undoubtedly saved the lives of who knows how many more young women and girls who Worrell would undoubtedly have murdered if he had continued to live. At this point, of course, Christopher Worrell had murdered 7 young women and girls, and I've absolutely no doubt that had he lived, there would have been even more victims. So after the car crash, Miller sustained, I believe, an injured shoulder and some minor injuries, but compared to his 2 companions, he was remarkably well off. They took Miller to the Kingston Hospital, which we'll just zoom into. Again, assuming this was the same place. So this was the Kingston Hospital where Miller was treated and released. Miller contacted an old workmate of his by the name of Dave, and Dave's girlfriend Amy, and also a young woman named Amelia, who had actually been dating Worrell in this period. The three of them drove from Adelaide and they picked Miller up. They picked Miller up from the hospital. Miller actually wanted to go back and inspect the scene of the car crash. That's what they did. Again, this is after midnight in the pitch black. And they inspected the road where the fatal crash had occurred. They then drove, the three of them, Dave, Amy and Amelia, then drove Miller all the way back to Adelaide. And as we cruise all the way back north to Adelaide, a fair distance, into the suburb of Parkside, which is an inner southern suburb of Adelaide. So this is Parkside down here, and this is the city here. This is where Dave and Amy lived. Now, what happened here in the back garden, now I don't know the exact address unfortunately of the Parkside home, but it was in Parkside. What happened in the back garden would be crucial. Miller and Amelia began talking. This is on the early morning of February, what was it now? February the 20th, 1977. Yeah, as I said, Miller and Amelia began talking, and Miller became quite upset, and he said words to the effect that Chris had to die. You know, and Amelia urged him to elaborate what he meant by that, and Miller told her that Worrell had done really bad things, that he'd been killing girls, and that Miller had seen this, and he could show Amelia where the bodies were. Miller even saying to Amelia that they were buried near Blanchetown, which is a town, I believe, about 45 kilometres from Truro. So that's what Miller basically confessed to Amelia, and those words would certainly come back to haunt James Miller when Amelia would report them to the police in the near future, and would be the undoing of James Miller. While we're here in Centennial Park, we may as well also check out the gravesite of Christopher Worrell, serial killer who is buried here in Centennial Park. Now, Worrell is in the lawn section, lawn 1 section, path 29, grave 1364. So it's just along here. So this is Christopher Worrell's grave right here. If you can read his tombstone, it says Worrell, Christopher Robin, beloved son of Gwen and Will, brother of Dan, died 19th of February 1977, age 23. Untold love and joy he brought to all, which of course is sickly ironic. Now, just to be fair, that when Worrell was killed in February 1977, his family had no idea that he was a serial killer, and obviously those words at the bottom there, that phrase is redundant, but at the time it just wasn't known, but it still remained here all these years. And now, with great irony, the fact is that one of Worrell's own victims, Tanya Kenny, is also buried in this very same section. Tanya is buried just 5 rows away. So that is just, well, how do I put it? Unfortunate. But nonetheless, that's the way it is here at Centennial Park. We're now on the corner of Sturt Highway and Swamp Road. And it was here that Christopher Worrell and James Miller drove into, and where they would dump 4 of the victims. Now, let's just pan around here so I could show you. It's a desolate sort of side track down here, so we're about 15 kilometers from the town of Truro, and this is Swamp Road. according to Google Maps, we're still just on the inside the Truro district, on the outskirts. But it was down this lonely road where Worrell and Miller would leave their victims. I'm on Swamp Road. Now we're about 1 kilometre from Sturt Highway. The exact location of the bodies is almost impossible to be precise with, so we're going with an approximate location. Now on Thursday, April the 20th, 1978, a man named Bill Thomas, along with his brother Rupert, were out here looking for mushrooms in paddocks. And they got off here on the left-hand side when coming in from Sturt Highway, and that's this side. So somewhere in this location, Bill Thomas and his brother got out looking for mushrooms. As I said, I don't know the exact locations, but we'll have there's a fence here now, so I can't really enter the grounds, but yeah, they went looking for mushrooms, and Bill Thomas found a leg bone with a shoe attached. But strangely, he actually dismissed it as being, a human body. So he went back home, and as you would guess, he was somewhat still perturbed by what he'd found. I'm not sure exactly what he thought he found, if it had a shoe attached to it, but nonetheless he thought about it, and his wife insisted that he go back and have a look. So 5 days after the initial find, on Tuesday, April the 25th, 1978, Bill Thomas returns with his wife Valda, and they go and check out the leg bone. And on a closer inspection, they saw that there was toes on the bone. They had a bit of a look around, and they found a skull. And so the police were alerted, and the police came out here, and it turned out to be the remains of Veronica Knight. Veronica, of course, 18 years old. She'd been murdered on December the 23rd, 1976. So somewhere in here, Veronica Knight was found. Now, if you recollect, Veronica was abducted in the city in Adelaide. Now, how she got exactly from Adelaide to Truro here, all we really have is James Miller's accounts, which he published in a book called Don't Call Me Killer. Now, whether those recollections are the truth or not is another question. But according to Miller, after they picked Veronica up in the city, Worrell asked her if she wanted to go for a drive, and he said Veronica at first said no, she needed to be in by 11:30 p.m. But then Worrell said that he would, so they agreed, and they drove into the Adelaide Hills and onto a dirt track. At the same time, Miller also said that they drove straight to Truro with Veronica alive. The usual story was that Miller left Worrell and the girl in the car, and when he came back, the girl was dead. So that's according to James Miller's story. Well, whatever the truth was, Veronica was buried out here on Swamp Road. I'm now much further along Swamp Road. I'm about 3.5 kilometres from the Sturt Highway, heading in a southerly direction. This is where the next victim was found. It was Sunday, April the 15th, 1979, almost a year to the day after Bill Thomas found the remains of Veronica Knight, much further closer to Sturt Highway. 4 men in 2 cars were returning home were driving back from Renmark to Adelaide, I assume, when they pulled into Swamp Road, and they drove all the way down here. The 4 men were Gary Sawyer, Ashley Matthews, Kim Hillman, and Adrian Ravina. Now, they pulled off to the side of the road, and they went into the bush about 300 metres from the road. Exactly why they went into the bush, I'm not sure. One can only speculate. But they did, and it was lucky they did, because somewhere in this vicinity, and again, I don't know exact location, You'd have to assume over near those trees. They found a human skull along with some clothing. They actually picked up the skull, got back into their cars, and they drove back into Truro, about 15 kilometres from here, into the town of Truro that is, and they found a police car and showed them what they had found. The police obviously had descended on this area. The remains were that of Sylvia Pittman, aged 16, who had been abducted on February the 6th, 1977. Now, when they found Sylvia's remains, of course, as I said, this was almost a year after Veronica Knight's remains were found, the police began to realise that they had a dumping ground on their hands, and they searched more, and they, of course, would end up finding the remains of Connie Ordonides and Vicky Howe, much further back in that direction. So Veronica Knight's remains were found on the left-hand side of Swamp Road if you're travelling in a southerly direction from Sturt Highway. Now remember, her remains were found on April the 25th, 1978. But amazingly, I believe the police did not think it was a murder. There was an assumption that Veronica may have died of heat stroke out here in the bush, which makes sense. But why Veronica would disappear in the city of Adelaide and be all the way out here in desolate Truro, I'm not really sure how they come to that conclusion. But so when Veronica's remains were found, it was treated as a one-off. But then, of course, on April the 15th, 1979, almost a year to the day later, the remains of Sylvia Pittman were found further down Swamp Road here. So when Sylvia Pittman's remains were found, the police obviously began to suspect that there were more bodies out here, and they were right, and they began to search. And on the opposite side of Swamp Road, which we'll call the right-hand side, or the western side, the police would find two more victims. On Thursday, April the 26th, 1979, police began searching in this general areas. Again, this is an approximation. The exact location, I'm not 100% sure, but somewhere in this scrubland. And at 1:30 p.m. on that Thursday, April 26, 1979, police found the remains of Connie Ordonides. 15-year-old Connie, of course, had been missing since February the 9th, 1977. And while searching this scrub area, they also found nearby the remains of 26-year-old Vicky Howe, who had been missing since February the 2nd, 1977. So the remains of Connie and Vicky were found somewhere in this general location. How far into the bush, I'm not exactly sure. It would have been a few hundred meters from the road. As I said, there's a fence up, so I can't enter the grounds here, but somewhere amongst those trees and bushes would the remains of the girls be found. I'm in Wright Court, Adelaide, just south of the Central Business District, and it was here where James Miller had his last day of freedom. It was Wednesday afternoon, May the 23rd, 1979. Miller was at a place called the Wright Court Day Centre, which Miller referred to as the Derelict Centre. Now, this was a place for homeless people, people had gone on hard times, etc. Place that operated during daylight hours. Now, the exact location of that establishment, I'm not sure, but it was here somewhere. It's obviously long gone by now. But at around 3 p.m. that afternoon, Miller was inside the day centre cleaning and washing. This was a job that paid him $2.50. At the time, Miller was homeless. As he was cleaning at the sink, Miller noticed a car was parked outside the building with a woman sitting inside, whom he described as being in her 20s. Now, Miller had been spooked the day before when he'd seen a car pulling up outside and he had fled the area. So obviously Miller was sensing that the net was closing in on him. To allay his suspicions, Miller went outside via a side entrance to see what kind of reaction he got from the person in the car. So Miller walked to Gooja Street, which is just at the end of this road up here and to the left. And when Miller did this, the car followed him. So Miller then doubled back and walked back to the centre, which may have been in this area here. A lot of this area is the old and the new. See some older homes over there with brand new buildings and newer buildings, so it's obviously changed a lot since 1979. So now Miller was back into the centre and he looked out the window, and once again that car with the woman in it had returned. At that point a second car arrived. This was driven by a man, and that man got out, walked over to the first car and spoke to the woman inside, and Miller observed that man showing the woman a photo. So now Miller obviously guessed that this could well be for him. Miller left again, this time by the front entrance, right inside of the car. At this time and then he returned again through a side entrance. He looked out, and once again the woman was still there in the car. So at this point Miller asked a young man whom he knew in the centre if he would go into the main office and see if there was anyone, if any police were in there. The young man did that, and he come back to Miller and he told Miller that yep, there was someone in the main office who was most likely a copper. So Miller left again. Yeah, not sure exactly where, but let's say it was in this street here. So Miller left the day centre again, and this time he was leaving for good. By this point he would have known that the game was up. What Miller didn't know, but was suspecting, was about to find out, was that the police had him under extensive surveillance. They had a whole team assigned to Miller watching him. So Miller left the centre and he walked into this side street, Field Street, which runs off Right Court. So that's Right Court there. Miller turned into Field Street and he began walking a bit further up here, which is to Gooja Street, which leads to the Adelaide Central Market. So Miller was trying to, as he said in his book, Don't Call Me Killer, he wasn't 100% sure the police were looking for him. Remember, it had been over 2 years since Worrell had died, but it had only been a few weeks since the bodies had been found at Truro. So now Miller reaches Gooja Street here, turns right, which is east, and begins walking along Gooja Street. As he walks along here, he also notices another car with two men sitting inside watching him. So Miller heads across the road and begins to head over towards the Adelaide Central Market. So onto Gooja Street, Miller crosses from the southern side of Gooja Street and he crosses over to the northern side, and he's just about at the Adelaide Central Market. At this point Miller was obviously trying to get the hell out of the area. He mentions in his book the ramp in the car park for the Central Market. So he reaches Adelaide Central Market and he begins to walk in. Obviously it's closed at the moment, but Miller begins walking into the Central Market and he begins to run. That's when he hears someone yell out, "Stop." Miller stops and he turns around. There's a young man dressed in civilian clothes who tells him to come with him, and they walk back out onto Gooja Street. This police operation surveillance is all undercover. So Miller re-emerges in Gooja Street. Miller says in his book that the undercover police did not identify themselves, but they were undercover police. the policeman who's with Miller speaks to someone on a walkie-talkie, and an unmarked police car arrives promptly on Guja Street. 2 detectives are in the car, and those detectives are Detective Sergeants Glenn Laurie and Peter Foster. They put James Miller into the unmarked car and drive him away to the nearby Angus Street Police Headquarters. So this entire area is where James Miller, the end came for James Miller. When he was put into the back of that police car, he would never see freedom again. He'd spend the rest of his days in prison. So this area right around here on Guja Street in Adelaide is where James Miller was arrested. I'm now on Bower Boundary Road, which is actually in the district of Annandale, just outside of Truro. I'm about maybe a couple of kilometres from Swamp Road. Now 4 of the victims were dumped on Swamp Road, but a 5th victim, Julie Makita, was dumped down here on Bower Boundary Road, and she was discovered when James Miller led police to them. Now after Miller was arrested back in Adelaide at Central Market, he was taken back to be interrogated at the Angus Street Police Headquarters. Miller at first denied any involvement with the murders, but then when the police worked him down and they confronted him with what he had said to Amelia, if you remember when Worrell had been killed, Miller had made a bit of a tearful confession to Amelia, saying that Worrell had murdered girls and dumped them near Blanchetown. When police confronted Miller with this, then Miller eventually cracked. Miller said that he personally didn't murder the girls, but that Worrell had, and Miller said he would lead them to the remains of the 3 missing girls at that time. This is on May the 23rd, 1979, May the 24th. So that very night, without waiting, the police, detectives Glenn Laurie, Peter Foster and William Koo, they got into police cars with Miller, and they drove all the way from the city, heading north. They came to Truro, past Swamp Road, and came down here on Bower Boundary Road, which, as I said, and Miller said he would lead them to the remains of one of the victims, Julie Makita. Now he said look out for a farmhouse. That was obviously Miller's marker, and to this day, this is 2025, remember, there's still a farmhouse over there. I assume that was the location it was in 1979-77, and there's a gate here. I think Worrell and Miller may have used this gate to enter to the scrub. Now obviously they didn't go to the farmhouse. They would dump Julie Makita's body about 50 metres from the road, so perhaps in that scrubland just over here, that's where Miller, in the dark no less, obviously they had torches and stuff, but in the pitch blackness, Miller would actually be able to locate where Julie Makita's remains were. So I think it may have been this gate they entered through, or the old gate anyway. Well, there's a gate here too, so perhaps. I distinctly remember an old 60 Minutes TV special about the Truro murders, and I remember Ray Martin with one of the police officers going out to find the spot where one of the victims was, and I think it might have been right here. This, as I said, here's a gate here. Obviously they wouldn't want to go near the farmhouse, but what's that down there? That looks like there's a bone down there. Some animal bones. Well, I hope it's animal bones. That's a bit odd, isn't it? Look at that. Seems a scattering of bones around here. Yeah, that's ironic, isn't it? I certainly hope that's animal bones. I mean, how do you tell? I mean, there's people in that house, so... But yeah, I'm pretty sure Julie Makita was dumped in the scrub somewhere around here. Of course, Julie was 16 years old and she'd been missing since January the 21st, 1977. And this is where she was found. Out here in the lonely scrubland of Bower Boundary Road. Yeah, somewhere in the scrub Julie Makita's remains were found, Miller led the police to them and amazingly was able to find her, even in the pitch black of the night. Obviously they had torches and what have you, but Miller was able to find the remains of Julie Makita. 16-year-old Julie, of course, had been abducted on January the 21st, 1977, some 2 years earlier. And her remains were found here on, was probably early May 24th, 1979 by that stage. Out here at Bower Boundary Road.